What's up, everybody? Rob here. So, the Streltsy were elite shock troops of Tsarist Russia from the 16th century to the 18th century. During that time period, they served the Tsar both on and off the battlefield, and eventually would become actively involved in the politics of the realm. But who were they? Well, I'm about to tell you, because that's pretty much the whole point of this video. So if you're interested in this topic, stick around. If you're not, well, watch it anyway, because I care not from whence the views come, only that they do. So here we go, without any further ado, a very brief look at the Streltsy. The name Streltsy simply means shooter, and as the name implies, these were soldiers who specialized in the use of ranged weaponry. And just so you know, a single Streltsy is known as a Strelets, and a Streltsy is simply the plural or the collective name for all of them. So, just the more you know. Any case, they were founded sometime between 1545 and 1550 by Ivan Grozny, better known here in the West as Ivan the Terrible, who tried to reform Russia's military. Now, I'm probably going to end up doing a video on Ivan the Terrible because he's a very interesting individual in his own right, and he deserves a video on his own, but no, that's another story for another day. As part of his military reforms, he ended up creating an initial unit of 3,000 of these Streltsy, and he divided these into 6 regiments of 500 men each. Their initial role was to support his household cavalry and also to act as shock troops during sieges. In peacetime, they were acting as garrison troops and firefighters, and they also had some policing duties as well. Over the centuries, they expanded their number, and by 1680, there were well over 50,000 of them. They were initially organized into units of around 500 men called a prikaz, which was itself divided into 100-man company-size units called a sotny, and this would be led by a sotnik, which is roughly equivalent to that of a captain. And I apologize, as always, for my horrifyingly bad pronunciation of anything that does not resemble modern English. As the name implies, the Streltsy were primarily ranged troops and were specialized in the use of the arquebus and later on the muskets, both the flintlock and the matchlock varieties, although they were sometimes known to use crossbows. For close-range work, they were most famously equipped with the bardiche, which is a long-bladed axe, which also doubled as a stand to support their very heavy muskets. And I've done several videos on the bardiche. Maybe you should check them out. I'm just suggesting, for again, I care not from whence the views come, only that they do. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Now, this was the era before the bayonet was invented, and so by using the bardiche as a musket stand, you could actually have a weapon close on hand in case you need to engage in close quarters after discharging your piece. So, for example, you would fire it, and if you needed to defend yourself at close quarters, all you had to do was simply drop the musket, and already in your hand would be a very large, very deadly axe. So, dual purpose there. In any case, they were also known to use other weapons, such as polearms like the poleaxe and the halberd, and they were equipped with much closer ranged weaponry, for example, sabers and other swords. They, surprisingly enough, were also issued uniforms, which is something that was fairly unusual this early in the early modern era. They were one of the first units to do so, and they would be given uniforms of matching color, blue, green, and oftentimes red, and strangely enough, repeated references to orange boots. Now, I've tried to figure out what orange boots actually mean. I'm assuming this means more like a tannish color, and that was just, sort of like a translation error. But in any case, their equipment and uniforms would all be identical. Now, these uniforms would be in the form of a kaftan, which is a very long coat, and for headgear, they would use something known as a kolpak, or a pointed sheepskin cap. Now, throughout all of these references, there's very, very little mention of the use of armor, but the kaftan is a very thick, heavy woolen coat, and it's very similar to that of a gambeson. So it would provide a significant deal of protection against slashing and some piercing damage. A bullet, of course, would go right through that. So the Streltsy is not exactly unarmored, and there are some references to iron helmets being used. However, these are comparatively rare. In battle, they had multiple roles dependent on the circumstances they found themselves in. In open field engagements, they would practice combined arms, working very closely with these household cavalry. They would engage the enemy at long range with their muskets in order to soften them up and to frighten them. And one of the advantages of using a firearm over more silent weapons like crossbows and bows and arrows is the morale effect it has on the opponent. For example, you're facing down a line of musketeers, and next thing you know, there's this really loud thunderclap, this giant plume of white smoke just erupting from their lines, and then your fellow soldiers are suddenly getting shot apart by chunks of lead that are flying towards them, yeah, that's going to have an effect on morale. Just the sound and the sights of all this, it's going to affect the enemy's morale in a very significant way, much more so than, say, a crossbow bolt or a number of crossbow bolts. And so that is just a small side. That's one of the reasons why firearms were adopted, even though the bow and arrow and the crossbow had longer range, they were more accurate, and a whole bunch of other advantages. Small side. Moving on, though. Well, in any case, they would oftentimes use rotating volley fire by ranks, which is basically the caracal formation, which I will demonstrate very briefly here. Okay, so rotating volley fire by rank, also known as a caracal formation, was commonly used by musketeers and also, incidentally, by cavalry as well. I've demonstrated this other times in other videos, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Suffice it to say, I got the Armageddon Steel Legion here representing the Streltsy in this case, and they would oftentimes have more ranks than this, but I'm just going for a basic demonstration here, not necessarily something super accurate. But in any case, you'd have the front lines here, and they have their matchlock muskets, and they'd be firing towards the enemy, basically, back towards me here, and they would open fire, and in order to reload, they would then rotate to the back of the formation. They'd be going through the gaps. It'd be a lot more elegant than this, but, hey, my limitations. The next rank behind them would move up into their previous position, where they were, again, being a lot more elegant than this, and then they would open fire, and then when that would happen, they would then rotate to the back, and then the next line behind that would then move to the front. So it would constantly be rotating, open fire, rotate to the back, and then move up in your position. Now, they wouldn't have only 2 ranks deep. That would, usually they'd be 3, 4 ranks, sometimes as many as 6 or 10 ranks deep. It really depends on the circumstances, the amount of training of the individuals participating in it, and the numbers they have available. Using 2 for basic demonstrative purposes. The whole point of this, though, is that while individuals within the formation are moving, the formation as a whole is actually staying in the same spot. They're treading over really the same ground, and the formation itself is very much stationary, although individuals within it are constantly rotating. Okay, got it? Caracal formation, rotating volley fire by rank. Understood it? Okay, good. Moving on. When the time was right, they would make way for the cavalry, who would then finally charge home and rout the enemy once and for all. And if the cavalry did need the support, they could either close with the enemy directly and help support them and finish them off, or they could be used as sort of a mobile fortress, using their bardiches and polearms as basically a screen for the cavalry to reform behind them. They can then continue either pouring musket fire onto the enemy, or they can again just close with the enemy directly themselves in close quarter combat. In siege warfare, they were used as shock troops, working their way closer to enemy breaches or weak points in the defenses, and then overrunning them through firepower and weight of numbers. In order to do this, one of their favorite tactics was the use of a mobile fortress called a goulet gorad, which I'm sure I mispronounced, but I apologize. In any case, it was a 3-walled timber fortification with slits cut in it for vision, as well as firing ports for their weaponry. It's goulet gorad literally means walking fortress, and that's pretty much what it was. It was a 3-sided wooden structure, very similar to a mantelet, which was used during the Middle Ages, and it had slits in it which could be used for both vision as well as firing ports for their weapons, and the whole contraption would be put on wheels so it could be rolled towards a fortification, while the Streltsy that were pushing it were protected from arrow and musket fire, although a direct hit from a cannonball or some other type of artillery piece like a mortar or something, that would probably just blast the whole thing apart. So it wasn't a foolproof plan, but it actually did give a great deal of cover while they advanced towards the enemy fortification. And they would make their way towards this breach into the walls, and when they were close enough, they would swarm out and take the breach and work their way into the fortification or into the city, and that would clear a path for other troops to follow in after them. This tactic was first used quite successfully at the Siege of Kazan in 1552, and the Streltsy were the spearhead for the eventual taking of the city after a mine underneath the city blew up, blasting a giant hole in the walls. The role of the Streltsy extended far beyond that of warfare, however. In peacetime, they were used as a garrison force, keeping the peace in both Moscow, where the bulk of the Streltsy were stationed, as well as in the more remote provinces. They were used for policing purposes, for escort duty, and were even employed as firefighters. Their main role in firefighting was to pull down buildings in the way of the fire, hoping to create a fire break and contain the spread of the fire, although as one Western traveler noted that they never actually used water to put out the fire. Basically, their job was to contain the fire and if a building was already on fire, well, you were kind of on your own. Now, the position of a Streltsy was available to both the nobility and commoners, with the nobility making up the officers and the commoners making up the rank and file, as one would expect. Anyone could join, and status as a member of the Streltsy would eventually become hereditary. So if you were a Streltsy, your child, your male children obviously, would become Streltsy as well, although they could recruit from people outside of their ranks. This eventually did reduce their combat effectiveness. Rather than recruiting the best and the brightest, they got basically whoever was born into it, regardless of their ability. We're still an effective fighting force, fighting very well in multiple conflicts, but as the 16th century gave way to the 17th century, it soon became apparent that there were weaknesses within the organization. And one of these actually has to do with economics. They were initially granted a salary, but the constantly cash-strapped Russian treasury was oftentimes very late with their payments, both in money and in grain, which they were also paid, and they were paid basically in food and money. And to make up for this, the Streltsy were granted permission to act as merchants and farmers and take up other duties as part of their financial compensation. And this was especially true in the rural provinces. For example, in some cases, they were actually granted land instead of pay. And while this did help in the short term to alleviate some of the fiscal burden, it also made them more hesitant to fight. For example, if you owned land or you had a business of some kind, you had to be there to make sure the harvest was taken in or to actually run your business. Otherwise, you didn't get paid. And if you were called up to fight, well, you're going to be kind of hesitant to do so because that actually could mean a loss of revenue for you. And also, this meant that time spent pursuing financial interests means less time actually training. And this obviously would reduce their combat effectiveness. There was another issue in that the Streltsy were also very conservative, small c conservative. The 16th century was one of near constant innovation. If you've been watching my channel at all, this is a constant theme that technology is constantly changing throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And in spite of this, however, the Streltsy resisted virtually all attempts at modernization and reform, instead clinging to tried and true methods of the past rather than updating to more modern, and by modern, basically more westernized forms of warfare. Now, as the 17th century progressed, the Streltsy swelled in number to about 20 to 25,000 men. It was during the 17th century that they took a much more active role in politics than they had previously. Now, sometimes these were minor rebellions with small individual units of the Streltsy either refusing to fight or in being involved in some sort of local revolution. But there were some major events that had very long-lasting consequences. For example, you have the Moscow Uprising of 1682. Now, this is a bit confusing, but I'm going to try to simplify it for you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so in order to help figure out all of this confusing, complex stuff, it's really not totally important for our story here, but I just figured I'd, get a little bit extra context as to what's going on here. Now, I am terrible at any sort of graphics design, any sort of animation, anything of that nature. I don't even know what programs to use, and I'm definitely not paying for one because this is not a high-quality operation. Boomer is a state of mind, not an age. But in any case, moving along. We got this guy right here. That's Tsar Fyodor III. Now, he died in 1682 without an heir. And, of course, this led to a succession crisis because nothing's ever easy. So you go back a generation to this guy here. Now, that's Tsar Alexei. He had two wives. The first wife was, and I'm going to mispronounce this, that is Maria Miloslavskaya. Now, they had 3 children together. That would be Tsar Fyodor, obviously him right there. There would be Sophia and Ivan. Now, Maria would eventually die, and then Tsar Alexei would eventually remarry. That would be Natalia, and I'm going to mispronounce this as well, Natalia Narishkina. Now, they would have one son together. That would be Peter. And spoiler alert, that is Peter the Great. So I think you know how this would eventually end up. So that's the family tree right here. The individuals you need to know about this are Fedor, who died, or Fyodor. Fedor is a Fedor is an MMA fighter. Not Fedor. Fyodor, Sophia, and Ivan, and then you got Peter over here from a different wife, one from Maria, last name, I pronounced it once, I'm not doing it again, and Natalia, and their son Peter, whom, again, last name I'm not going to pronounce. Okay, that's the family tree, moving on. So the obvious choice of successor was Ivan. However, the problem here is that Ivan actually was mentally not up to the task. I think very much like Henry VI in England, how he just really was not mentally, well, capable of running a country, and really nobody wanted him as czar. Now, the other option was Peter, who was 10 years old at the time, therefore too young. So a national council was convened, and all the boyars and nobles of Russia gathered together, and long story short, they eventually chose Peter as the czar, with a ruling council in place in order to guide him until he reached the age of majority. Okay, pretty simple. However, Sophia was not happy about this arrangement at all. She wanted more power for herself, and so she gathered a few regiments of the Moscow Streltsy together, and together they stormed the Kremlin and lynched numerous boyars, including Peter's uncles, that would be the brothers of Natalia, Kirill and Ivan, right in front of Peter, who, well, that scarred him mentally, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Any case, with the pressure of these Streltsy, the council was reconvened, and it was agreed that Ivan and Peter would rule together as co-czars, with Sophia acting as regent and basically as the ruler of the country until Peter came of age. This state of affairs lasted until 1689, when Peter reached the age of majority, and conveniently enough, Ivan died of natural causes, meaning that Sophia had lost her power and Peter was now in charge of Russia. Now, in a last-ditch attempt to maintain her hold on power, Sophia ordered a regiment of Streltsy to overthrow Peter. However, the regiment in question actually, well, they didn't. They knew where their bread was buttered, I guess you can say, and they sided with Peter on this, and eventually Peter was able to secure his power base, and Sophia was sequestered off to a nunnery. The next and the most famous and significant of the Streltsy revolts occurred in 1698 and was creatively called the Streltsy Revolt of 1698, because let's not put any effort into naming things. In any case, Peter the Great was very famous for his westernization program. He basically brought Russia, which was at this point a very conservative regional backwater, and he brought it into the modern world kicking and screaming. Now, the very conservative and anti-Western Streltsy did not take too kindly to this, and in 1698, when Peter was on his grand tour throughout Europe, they took their chance, and several regiments of them marched on Moscow, where they hoped to seize control of the government and restore Sophia to power, basically overthrowing Peter while Peter was not there. So when Peter did show up, well, what's he going to take over? We're basically in control at this point. Long story short, they were beaten in the field about 25 miles outside of Moscow by a much more modern, westernized military force under the command of Scotsman Patrick Gordon, whom Peter had taken into his service some years before. Now, although the revolt was broken and the Streltsy were ultimately defeated, Peter did cut short his tour and returned back home, where he helped to clean up the remnants. Now, he very, very clearly remembered what the Streltsy had done back in 1682, especially the killing of his uncles basically right in front of him, and he honestly did not hold back this time. Those that participated in the revolt were tortured in incredibly gruesome and creative ways, such as being whipped to death. They would be stretched on the rack until broken. Basically, you would be stretched apart until you just basically rip in half. And a very popular one was the breaking on the wheel, which was a very popular torture in the Middle Ages and was continuing on even in this more modern and hopefully enlightened era. Basically, you get a giant wheel. It's basically enough for a person to be tied onto, and the torturer would take iron bars and they would break your bones very systematically. Basically, they would work from the outside in, and they would smash your hands, and then they'd smash your feet, then they'd smash your forearms, and then they'd smash your shins, and then they'd smash your upper arms, and then your thighs, and so on. Basically, they'd work from the outside, work their way in, smashing bones along the way until you died from it. As you can imagine, this is extremely painful. Overall, about 1,200 were executed in these ways, and 3 men were very specifically hanged in full view of the convent window where Sophia was being imprisoned at this point. The Moscow regiments, which did not participate in the uprising, were disbanded anyway, effectively ending the power of the Streltsy. They were officially disbanded as an entire organization after the revolt, but after the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Narva in 1700 against the Swedish Empire, they would be undisbanded because, well, let's just face it, Peter needed experienced troops. Still, their time was very limited, and eventually the Streltsy would be integrated into the regular army, and there would still be units as late as the 1720s located in rural areas, but eventually these would fade away into history. So that is it for this video. Just a real quick one here. I thought it'd be interesting. I'm working on one right now, continuation on the 30 Years War series that I have going. I'm putting most of my effort into that. I just figured this would be a nice little diversion from that. And yeah, I hope you found it interesting and entertaining. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a good day. Or don't have a good day. Your adults have any kind of day you want. See you later.